Thank you.
Thank you, Jaisal. And I welcome John, Ashish, Priti, Manish, and Cherie on the panel to really take supply chain now. What are the trends? I think supply chain trends, experiences, and observation. I just briefly mentioned about the way I think about what's going to be more resilient, more responsible, and more agile supply chains. Without wasting much time, I would move to the panel and we will look at the whole trends and experiences as well as observation in terms of three broader categories. One is technology, second is planning, and third is transformation of the total supply chain. Obviously, transformation of total supply chain, as John would agree, would also involve the geopolitical and geographic angle for organizations to look at their outside in disruptions. So, John, let me start with you.
Yep.
What do you think are the baggages of the past supply chain challenges, and what challenge they pose for newer supply chains?
I think I heard what you said. This is really under the subheading, isn't it, of trends, Rakesh? What trends are we seeing? Okay. I suppose my observation in that one is that by the time you see a trend, it's already too late. But having said that, you know, I sort of listen a fair bit to Jim Collins, who's not a supply chain guy, but, you know, well-known researcher management. And he talks right now about what he calls a period of ferocious instability that the world is facing. So in short, if there is a trend, what we're seeing now is volatility and more volatility. So that sets up the scene for us to consider how we're going to develop the capability to face this sort of emerging capability, and I'll say more about that under observations. But I think what I'm seeing now, and sadly it's only happening amongst what I call the best companies. And when I say the best companies, I mean the best led companies, because the only word that I believe in that's the most important word in management vernacular today is leadership. And if you look around the world and you see the companies that are doing well through good times and through bad times, some of which are represented on this panel today, you know which ones are the best. But I think that we're seeing a definite shift away from the laissez-faire, one-size-fits-all approach, follow-your-nose approach of the way we've designed supply chains in the past, which we've got away with for a long time because all the sins were covered by growth, and didn't matter what we did, we sort of still made money. And I think that people now are starting to seriously, consciously think about how do we design our supply chains to meet the expectations of our target market. So that's happening. There is a little bit of what I would call confusion in terminology out there, mainly created by people like Gattorna, who don't seem to sort of really understand this stuff in depth. They talk about supply chain segmentation, which there is no such thing. It's customer segmentation, from which you then derive the differential supply chains and value propositions that you're going to meet those expectations. I think the other big trend is, and it's really speeded up as a result of COVID. I would say right now that COVID has probably moved forward the cause of change by, if not 10 years, a generation. And what I mean by that is that people are doing things now which they would never have conceived that they would do, including internal collaboration inside companies which are very vertically integrated, but they're starting to talk to each other, which is a new phenomenon in management, that you actually talk to your colleagues. But I think that what I'm seeing now is this clear understanding by the better companies of the need to find ways to make faster decisions means will let us be agile, it'll let us be resilient, it'll give us all the things we need to be, all those things that Rakesh talked about. And we'll talk more about that. And the final point I'd make, which I think is a bit of a recognition, again, coming out of the difficulties we've had this last year, is that the supply chain, God bless it, is actually the platform for change. It's a genuine platform for change, because if you want to, if you're transforming your supply chain, you're effectively transforming the whole business. It's very difficult to separate the two. And so I think this has been a fantastic realization, because all along the supply chain we've got people and their behavior, and we're starting to realize that yes, we've got plenty of technology around, but we've got to blend that technology with the behavioral component to get what I call true transformative change. And I'm writing a paper right now with a friend of mine from Washington, and she's been in the change business for a long time, and she makes some distinctions between sort of transactional change, which is, you know, going through the steps of changing, and then it's very easy to flip back because you haven't actually changed anything, you know, versus transformational change, where you have to change your technology, you change your people, you change your organization design, and bingo, it's hard to go back when things get tough. So you keep going forward. So I think the trends I'm seeing in the short term in the last year or so mainly come out of the last year of the sort of the difficulties we've had to force people to be a lot more thoughtful about their supply chain. And I think the supply chain has bubbled to the top in the consciousness of the CEO and the top team. That's a major trend that I'm seeing, Rakesh.
Thank you, John, and that sets up the tone for discussion in a big way. Manish, I think John concluded rightly to get you inside the panel. He talked about change, and you have been championing change as a major process of supply chain transformations across your career as an IBP expert. What do you think are going to be the new trend in terms of the overall supply chain dynamics that have changed in terms of consumer behavior, what John talks about in terms of segmentation, as well as the importance of visibility, leadership, and change management? And what role do you think organizations can play to meet these challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Rakesh, and thanks, John, for just setting me in for this discussion. You know, I'll talk from my IBP experience rather than my supply chain experience of 15 years. And if one thing that IBP has done to me as a supply chain professional is it's made me a far better supply chain professional. And the reason I say that is one change that I'm seeing now is supply chain as a function was always and will always remain central to what we call the integrated business planning in an organization. But it should only remain central and not own it. That is the change that I'm seeing now. Earlier, say 5 years back or 7 years back, you would often have organizations, some of the best, some of the mid-tier organizations, and even the smaller organizations have supply chain own the planning process, whatever name you give it. But now organizations are realizing that supply chain as a function should be central to it, but not owning it. The only way that this change happens is when the commercial organization, that is the CEO of the organization, owns it. And in order to make that, if I might say, that pitch for making that change happen, sometimes you need amazing data to prove that you're not performing as an organization when you're driving IBP or anything just as a planning tool versus trying to transform your businesses. Or sometimes situations like what we're just experiencing right now, COVID, it tells you and it gets you right on your face that it has to be the commercial organization and the P&L owner who can drive this integrated business planning and drive the transformation. Because it's not just about the planning, it is the fundamental way in which the organizations work themselves and cutting those decision times from, if I might say, when they were vertically integrated to something like 3 months or 6 months or 7 months on an issue that comes up to I would say a month or two, because the process by itself brings visibility to such a high level, and it really puts the issue and the potential options that you have to make that decision so clearly in your face that there is no way that you can avoid not taking a decision on that. So for me, IBP is more change management rather than just a process which enables business to function in an efficient manner or an effective manner. And that is the single biggest change that I've seen, CEOs owning it versus functional leaders trying to own that process. Over to you, Dr. Rakesh.
Thank you, Manish. I think that resonates with what John says in terms of leadership, owning the change and owning the the new transformation that is required. Let me move to Priti. Priti is from the pharmaceutical industry. This has been one of the most disrupted and one of the most active industry during the pandemic and during the most extreme disruption, as John calls it. What do you see as a major change required for supply chain to work in the newer environment? And what are the larger trends that you see that are happening?
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Rakesh. So I think one is that probably I'll give a perspective, not just pharmaceutical, but it's also more general healthcare and consumer goods as well. We play in all the industries from a Johnson & Johnson perspective. So I think few of the points, which Dr. John or Manish you spoke about, and I think Dr. Rakesh you mentioned as well, to start off with, I think it's something that we all know that there has been an accelerated pace in which how the technology has got really adopted, right, and more so in supply chain space. So the adoption has really accelerated, and some of the themes that come to my mind that have really been on the forefront for leaders or supply chain leaders is around the proactiveness as well as predictability, right? And that has also gotten a lot more focus because of the lack of resources as well as the crunch of time, cost when it came to COVID scenario. So with that backdrop, a few things that I've seen certainly a change or somewhere where we are heading towards is one is to have a very strong foundation, right? And when I say foundation, I'm talking about more a technology/data foundation, right? So I think strengthening that data and technology foundation is something that's really accelerated, something where probably leaders in the organization would spend hours to question why has really become a thing of the past now, right? That said, it's still not as easy wherein, no money comes in without the right challenges, but there has been a shift in the mindset that it is something which is a must do, wherein having a very, very robust, I would say, data as well as analytical landscape or a architecture that supports a very good data availability, governance, and the whole, I would say, the whole data structure or the enterprise architecture be surrounded. The second, what I've seen is that once you have the foundation, I think the other part also has been in terms of how do we make sure we get point in time or real data, right? So, and that's where all these IoT, and I'm not going to throw in the technology names there, we are all familiar, but I think that's where the right time or real time data availability comes into play. So a big shift there as well, and that's not been only in a certain part of supply chain, but really having that point in time data across every node in the supply chain. So that's something we've seen that's accelerated, in the new normal or with the new trends coming in. Not that it was not there before. And then I think, we did talk about transformational stuff. And one of the key elements, I think, Dr. Rakesh, you mentioned that in your opening speeches, where I see acceleration is that end-to-end connected visibility, right? And that's a critical piece in supply chain. Organizations have different level of maturity when it comes to how good they are in providing visibility in different nodes of the supply chain, but having that connected visibility for really quick actionable insights. And this is not post event. We are really looking at how can we predict it better to take better, faster decisions at every node and supply chain. And I think that piece has really picked up from a transformational readiness perspective. So I'll just leave that with the three emerging themes or trends. Back to you, Dr. Rakesh. Hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Priti. Let me take that question to Ashish also. Ashish is in SAP. And, Ashish, technology has been always spoken of as a penny of all ills. Organizations have resorted to technology whenever there's been disruption. And I think I, as an academic, have been seeing that, we say that if you just do end-to-end connectivity with those APOs or softwares, you would have actually created a visibility, and then the famous Boolean problems would have been solved. But I think we keep on having the similar problem as you go ahead. What is so new about the current technology or SC 4.0 trends, which is actually driving some amount of innovations within organization and both inside out and outside in innovation within organizations?
Thank you, Dr. Rakesh. John, excellent start, because what I'm going to say kind of dovetails into what you were talking about earlier in terms of breaking of silos, etc. And it's the same thing I think Manish brought up as well as Priti. Now, let's take a couple of steps back. Is supply chain a given, right? It's not, right? It's if you've seen the ever given situation in Suez, it's never a given, right? So, what I have been seeing in AP, the Asia Pacific region, is while we are the supply chain basin of the world in terms of, say, if you take, say, high tech, auto, chemical, pharma, minerals, metals, textile, the list goes on. Our visibility when it comes to really getting into the map of large software companies when they are designing their products has been very limited. And I'll give you a situation. So I was participating in a World Economic Forum event in which we were talking about a lighthouse program that they sponsor, which basically this lighthouse program are what John mentioned as the best run companies, kind of companies. 69 companies were chosen, and out of that only 8 were from the Asia Pacific region. So it's never been a very fair representation of what's going on in our neck of the woods, our issues, our problems, which is going to satisfy the supply chains of the Western world. And that's something what has happened, and I'm seeing that more and more now, is because of the pandemic and the way the pandemic kind of came about in the eastern part of the world first and then moved globally. There is more and more attention being paid to certain parts of the bullwhip, as you mentioned, Dr. Singh, that were never addressed when people were designing software or for end-to-end supply chain. So, that is something that is coming more and more, and I'm seeing it purely from wearing the lens of one of the largest enterprise software company in the world, wherein I am deeply entrenched in the development organization to kind of bring in the inputs of what's going on in our part of the world. Now, coming to the point around, what is it that's really happening? So we have taken, and this is again across the board, everyone has taken the theme of a resilient supply chain and started to map into, say, the organizational part of it. What does it need to be done in order to break the silos in an organization? But if I were to wear the lens of a technology provider or a technology experienced individual, what I'm seeing is this whole concept of Industry 4.0, and I'm mentioning this not just because I lead that for AP, but because of the fact that it's so misconstrued in a lot of ways. It was always seen as something that was specific to a manufacturing environment. if you really look at resilient supply chains and start looking at what are those components of the supply chain that will make a supply chain resilient, you bring in the whole product design part of it. You bring in the whole manufacturing, the sourcing, procurement, the asset management part of it, the logistics distribution, the last mile, all of that is connected. And all of that can be driven better with things like, say, how do we make the entire supply chain faster? How do we make it more granular so that it is, it can be adapted to a supply chain of one? How can we make it flexible so that today, if say one of the largest Japanese electronics company, which was making consumer electronics, has to switch and make ventilators, how quickly can they do that? How can manufacturing systems support that move? And how accurate is that data? How relevant is that data? And to end it all, how sustainable is this whole exercise that we are putting together? And that is something I'm seeing more and more coming out of the larger Asia Pacific companies when they are talking about improving their supply chains because they got slapped with COVID, because they got slapped with some other disruptions that has happened in the last decade. And that's my key takeaway, Dr. Rakesh. That's my key takeaway, that A, we are in the map when it comes to the software development in the backend, and B, this whole myopic concepts of, say, Industry 4.0 or sustainability, which was earlier limited to just the carbon part of it, is so much more expanded and made relevant to the Asia Pacific world. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Ashish. I think that's a good dimensions that you have brought in. And I will move to Cherie. And I think you ended where I wanted Cherie to come. In terms of sustainability as a part of the past trends and the future, in a more responsible supply chain, where does it sit and how it's going to drive the supply chain in future?
Great, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Maybe just 1 minute as a background. So I've spent the last 20 plus years of my professional experience working all along the supply chain, but very specifically in agricultural commodities and forest products. So I started in finance and microcredit to microcredit loans for farmer cooperatives to corporate finance for very large agribusiness companies. And then probably about 10 years ago, I made the switch over to sustainability, working for an NGO, WWF, leading their forest conversion issues on palm oil, and then working at Unilever on sustainable sourcing and smallholder development. And then now with an integrated forest-based company that integrates its operations from forest plantations to textile fiber rayon. So I like what the panelists were talking about, but also the specific context of Asia Pacific and how relevant Asia is and how important Asia is to supply chains. In terms of trends, I guess, what I would say is very much like the panelists, this is really about building resilient supply chains, but it's also about the transformation of many of the companies. So what I'm seeing is real shift from volume-based commodities to more value creation. So many of these upstream companies are investing much more into refinery capacity, where they're actually delivering and getting closer and closer to consumers. But I'm also seeing a lot more consolidation around, say, manufacturing and their tie-ups and partnerships with their suppliers, and also trying to work more directly with farmers. I think part of this is driven by a lot more conscientiousness about sustainability in supply chains, and that's really going to remain quite critical going forward. Efforts that goes beyond just sustainable sourcing to be about the transitions to decarbonize and how do you demonstrate the impact that you're making in supply chains, particularly with the social development goals. With that comes a lot more of a need for transparency within the supply chain to really understand the origins of where materials are grown, are produced, addressing more concerns on environment and social impacts, trying to make those de-links of deforestation and human rights violations within your supply chains. So really, as observations, 4 things: sustainability and building climate resilience is going to be much more embedded in the way we do business. The cost of ignoring these will have business and reputational implications to many companies. The second is really know the source of your materials, understand your supply chains, go beyond certifications, understand the life cycle of your products, and then focus on where you can deliver and drive impacts, be it on greenhouse gas, water, or emissions impact. The third is obviously the role that digital can play in the adoptions of technologies to improve efficiencies, driving productivity. And then finally, I think where we will see the shift is towards much more contractual relationships, building on long-term partnerships, driving and delivering innovations, and being really a voice for that transformation in this region.
Thank you, Cherie. I think that's a very good dimensions that you brought about as far as the future of more responsible, sustainable, and resilient supply chain is going to be. Because one of the biggest risks that is not meeting the sustainability norms as we move ahead. Hopefully, the world moves towards social goals and climate norms, and strive towards a more responsible place to live in. And Asia Pacific definitely, as we grow, the impact on our responsibilities to manage climate becomes more important, and I think that's the way to go. Moving ahead with the panel, John, I would like you to talk about converting technology assets and human assets in terms of transformation in the supply chain, as everybody brought about this angle.
Yep.
And how these two actually are very interdependent and symbiotic in terms of building the new organizations and new supply chain organizations of tomorrow.
Yep. Well, one thing I can say is that in just to give you a bit of background there, since my heady days at Accenture, where we used to run $400–500 billion type transformations, putting in ERP systems, mostly SAP. Those big bang type of transformations, I think, are gone forever. I think what people now are looking at are taking smaller transformations in steps, achieving the objective, learning in a continuous innovation way, and moving on to the next stage, the next stage, the next stage, and in the process taking your people with you. I think a friend of mine just recently finished a PhD about this whole idea of, how do you do that, and that came to the conclusion, fairly simple conclusion, that really to get people to go with you in a big transformation or even a smaller transformation, you've just got to recognize them much more and recognize the value and what they bring to the business virtually on a daily basis so that they go with you. We don't get to a point where we start turning things on and everyone in the business is turned off. But just moving away from that concept, just thinking about this, Rakesh, and I'm putting it under the heading of experiences in the second stage here. In the last year, we've been focused more as a thought leadership firm on helping companies design and launch control towers. Now, I've been looking at control towers for a while, but what I've recognized is control towers are the most fantastic vehicle for change, because what it forces you, if you're going to put a control tower in, it forces you to map your processes, internal and external. It makes you, it virtually forces you to digitize in a way where you have a digital twin, which goes along with the physical flow of the goods. It effectively gives you an end-to-end transparent supply chain from inside the business through the different functions and then downstream to the customer. And the most important thing, I mean, a lot of people talk, again, people like Gartner confused us all, because, you know, my view of supply chain of the prime reason for having a control tower in the first place is that, like as in an airport, they don't control things, but they know what's going on around. They can see problems emerging. They can put out real-time alerts, and in the process, they really improve the customer satisfaction levels in the company. Now, later on, once you've got your head around that scope, you can then start to take it back out to where Manish was talking about, into planning, tactical levels, and then beyond that into more strategic levels. You accumulate data all along the supply chain on a literally minute by minute, hour by hour, daily basis, and then that gives your whole analytics team a chance to look at what's going on and feed back into the planning process. It brings all the functions together, because in my view, just extending what Manish was saying, I like this idea of a multidisciplinary team sitting there together in the cockpit and discussing with each other and having connections back to their function, whether it be production or commercial or supply chain, and working real time. And that's part of that quick decision making that we talked about earlier. So it helps us sort out our processes, our data, our technology. It gets us much more proactive, and in a sense, it's a microcosm of the way we want to run the business. So I'm focusing on this particular mechanism as the mechanism to drive change across the business and then beyond the business to our partners on the supply side and on the demand side. And we've had quite a lot of success really helping people, you know, and companies like Schneider Electric have now got a network of 7 of these around the world, all interconnected, all working, and the level of customer satisfaction's gone up by, I don't know, by 25, 30% over the last few years since they had it. So that's where I see technology helping us. But of course, I'll talk a bit more later about, but we need to bring the behavioural aspect along with us, because we must have technology and people's behaviour working together to get the full benefits of our technology.
Manish, I think that's also takes me to you, and then I'll open up the panel to everybody to contribute on this. You know, the digital twin which John talks about is a very, you know, oft-repeated lament in supply chain transformation today. How do you think processes like advanced SNOP, IBP planning are important in creating a framework for connected planning? Because as I said, even if you are connected, what I see is that there's a lot of silos, as Ashish says. Where does your distribution and fulfillment reside within the connected tower? Where does your sourcing reside? Where does your smart factory reside? And I think these are also areas of similar concern as we talk about complete visibility end to end. So how does this change process, which we bring about in organization to support such kind of planning, are important, and what is happening in organizations?
Yeah. So let me if I've understood this correct, from an IBP perspective, the case for connected planning and the case for the story where the impact is in whatever planning aspect you're doing, whether you're talking on the product side, which is more about innovation and retiring products or rationalizing them, whether it's the supply side or the demand side or the P&L itself. The decisions can be made shorter and the cases can be made only if the connections are drawn. And to the point of what Dr. John was saying, it's that multidisciplinary team which can do it. Otherwise, it all remains extremely functional in nature. And functional pitches nowadays don't really sell. The only way something really sells in the organization to the leadership is if we can connect the dots in a big organization, more than even a smaller organization. So the case is very effectively made for connected planning, simply because you are then showing the business impact of not taking that decision which is there on the table. So if let's say we're talking of have control towers or not, therefore should the role of control tower, which is about working like an ETC, which is the triggers, the absence of a control tower, what does it do for business? If that comes out clearly, then only there is a case for a control tower. If the impact of not having a multidisciplinary team trying to get the decision-making process to become shorter doesn't show the impact of what it is to the business, again, the case is not big. So as I understood your question, how does it connect the whole idea of connected planning? It's at the base of it, and no case is ever made if in IBP if you can't show the overall picture. That's been my experience with two very different organizations, that when the business ownership comes, the push to know the business impact comes. Otherwise, it remains a very functional approach towards planning, and therefore never really sells very well, because functions just remain within themselves. They only try to drive functional excellence, and for lack of a better word, never really drive business excellence. And that is where the case gets made. But if Dr. Rakesh, you wanted me to tackle it differently, please do let me know, because that's what I understood of the question that you put up for me.
Yeah, you have summarized the question better than what I really wanted you to answer. So I think that brings about even the answer to the question in a big way. I would also like to have Priti's and Ashish and Cherie's view on this, because this is one of the most significant view. While we talk about technology, we talk about technology 4.0, SCM 4.0. I think this drive towards a very effective control tower, a very well orchestrated SCM 4.0, which increases efficiencies, scalability, granularity, and makes supply chain more agile, is important. So I would just want the audience to also hear that what are the trends that are happening in terms of making these technology work for organizations. So Priti, we start with you.
Yeah, so I'll probably pick from what Manish, where Manish left, and a good point that he made was on the connected visibility piece, right? So I think one of the key things I would say is that it's good to start off first. So they're always a two-prong, right? Whether we should start with what do you need, what are those connection points, and what is the value that we are driving, or what is the problem we are solving, or what is the value that we are driving for the business. So that's one angle. To then say that, and an example would be, are we looking at providing better, I would say, product availability to the end customer, right? And then you really work back to then say which are those points that we want to connect to in the supply chain, and then pull the relevant data, right? And the other flip side could be, do we want to have an underlying data already and then look at how we can connect the dots? And it's always, it's tricky. And my take is, organizations generally struggle with an either-or approach, right? And I don't think any organization can get to a perfect world in either-or, and I'm sure, so we've got to have a hybrid to say in certain amount, you want to have probably, 80-90% of the common data available. And I think some portion of that, Dr. John alluded to in his conversation, where we are saying, have that base underlying data ready, then also look at what is that value proposition that we are looking at for that control tower or connected visibility, and then really have that consumption-based approach to pull whatever is delta and slowly build on the building blocks. So I think that would be another way of kind of really accelerating that digitalization, as well as probably realizing the value much faster.
Yeah, please.
So, Priti, I kind of, I've seen both sides, because again, I engage with so many customers, right? So I've seen both sides of the story, wherein, companies with very little readiness of data are thinking about how do we improve our supply chains. And then there are companies who have data-rich foundation, are kind of then looking at the processes, right? And there is no right or wrong, because one could accelerate the other. But what I have seen, to again dwell on that point of data, is when companies are thinking in a very traditional way of saying, I will improve my customer satisfaction, for instance, or improve my OEE at the shop floor level, or improve my utilization at that level, all of that, that's a certain school of thought. But then there are companies who are thinking completely disruptive. They are saying, I will now offer my products as a service, right? And I will change my supply chain completely, my partners, my outsourcing partners, all of that in a very, very different way. And that time there is no data readiness because there is so much gap in the data, right? And I feel that one shouldn't, when they are thinking blue sky, it's super important that you consider the disruptive part as well as the traditional supply chain management, and see how I do efficiency improvement there and improve resiliency there. So you need to take both, and I feel one feeds the other. But if you have a disruptive thought and then you say, I have gaps in this data, so let's fix that, and then you draw your crawl, walk, run, sprint kind of a map in your organization and say, from crawl to walk, what we will do is we'll bring in efficiencies in our customer satisfaction levels, for instance, and address the needs of today's customer. And for that, X data is needed. While we are doing that, we are looking at that whole disruptive way of engaging with the market and say, we will plug in the data. And for that, if I need a backend system, which is more digital in nature, which has a better connectivity to the external world, let that be so. So I've seen both sides of the coin, and I feel this is where APAC is now taking the lead. And I'm seeing that kind of a discussion because APAC companies want to leapfrog their Western counterparts by looking at a disruptive way of thinking. And Cherie, to your point on sustainability as well, every APAC company I'm engaging with in terms of supply chain improvements, they are bringing in a huge discussion around, are these supply chain improvements sustainable, or they are ticking off those SDGs that we have aligned ourselves to. So, I'm seeing both in a big way.
Cherie, what is your take on technology? Again, you have been working in more responsible value chains, and what advantage have you seen and how they are getting adopted there? Because these are more vulnerable sections that you have been working with, like, for instance, the farmers and through your non-banking financial corporations in terms of providing credit to them. So what do you think technology can do? And Asia Pacific has a large amount of this as a base to act as a major customer base in future. Because I remember a book written by an Indian American academics, who was an Indian, D.K. Prahlad, on the poverty. It was called Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, and I think that supply chain was one of the most interesting supply chain that we talked about for years. I don't know what has happened to that, but I think you remind me of that. So what are your take on that?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that as a sustainability professional, first and foremost, I think we are underutilizing the capability of digital technologies to really support us to first understand, to use the data to understand our baselines and drive impact. And I think very often sustainability has always been seen as a cost center because, certification costs money, buying certified materials also costs money to supply chains. But I think what we're missing is the ability to really understand your processes and use certain sustainability metrics of, say, monitoring your emissions to actually drive operational efficiencies, to promote circularity within your production, and ultimately drive down operational cost, and deliver a better product for the consumers. And I think so. I think this is where things are evolving. You are seeing many companies start to think about, how do we design better? how do we deliver more environmentally friendly products and drive much more technology into delivering the products that are fit for purpose for the future. So one of the things in the textile industry that we've been talking about is how do you take all of the textile waste that is thrown away today in this very linear system of make and discard, and how do you actually recycle them back in your production process, where actually a greater proportion of your raw material is recycled textiles. So you're seeing that trend happen in many of the brands where they're actually promoting that this, piece of garment is made with recycled polyester or recycled textile. I think the other aspects is really also driving much more partnerships between NGOs and the private sector to understand global scale impacts. And particularly, you're seeing some of these technologies available, such as the Global Forest Watch from World Resource Institute, that you can actually go online and you can see where the deforestation is happening, what's happening in your supply chain, and use this as a tool for managing the risk in your supply chain. And finally, I think as a company, what we've also done is we've utilized technology. So while John talked about these control towers, we've invested very heavily in these greenhouse gas flux towers to actually measure the greenhouse gases within our own operations in the different landscapes where we operate, and use this as a way of managing our operations such that we can minimize our impact and support the commitments made by countries and companies in managing climate issues within 1.5 degrees. So I think technology will play a very pivotal role going forward in helping us make decisions, in helping us manage the efficiency of our operations, and also driving innovations in the delivery of new products.
Ashish, you have been working on Sustainability 4.0. Any addition to what Cherie said?
No, I think I completely am with Cherie's view on how digital or data or systems or technology can kind of give you that platform for managing this. One of the things that, again, being a supply chain professional who has now started to dabble in sustainability, I see a linkage between both in a big way, right? So, for instance, if you are looking at material traceability and you are going to the nth level of from a sourcing side, from a procurement side, looking at where is that material coming from, is it ethically sourced, it is it complies with standards, etc. You have already touched upon this fact of visibility to the nth level, right? Which is interesting because then you are killing two birds with one stone. Yes, there is a cost to the whole process, but in the long term, when we are trying to build resilient supply chains, this comes super handy. And similarly, talk about this whole circular economy you talked about, where you are designing the product to make sure that the end of life of the product is in a sustainable way. It's again bringing in the elements of resiliency, because when you are sourcing for goods for or suppliers for that particular product, you are starting to think that way as well, and you are looking at an alternative supplier base to make sure that the whole process is sustainable as well. So you are kind of stretching the word sustainability in the right direction, because often when I started this whole sustainability discussion 5 years ago in the APAC region, I could just see everyone wanting to get a tick in the box on the climate part of it, the whole carbon part of it. And now more and more, I am looking at people who are talking about employee health and safety as one of the key elements of sustainability. And why did that happen? That's because, again, with the way the COVID thing happened and the way, there was a risk to people and to people on the shop floor and in the logistics environments. How do you manage that? And that became a very key topic, balancing both sustainability and supply chain resilience and viability of the supply chain itself. So yeah, I'm with you that when we are talking to our customers today, they are taking technology as a huge foundation to addressing all of this. And while, and they're using technology also to break down the silos that was discussed earlier, because now you have visibility beyond the walls of these very rigid sub-organizations within organizations. So that's my quick take on this topic.
Thank you, Ashish. I think that adds a lot of value. I would, we are running towards the end of the session, so I'll ask John, Manish, and Priti to, put their final words into the panel. John, we can start with you.
Okay, just a quick, I congratulate Cherie and her work at Rayon. I think the great hope for us going forward is that the top 1,000 companies in this world do the things that you're talking about and forget about government leadership. We're getting no government leadership, or we didn't under Trump. We've got nothing in Australia much. It's all political. And these boys, they're going to be left behind. They're going to be in a situation in a couple of years where governments are going to have to follow what you are doing, because there will be no other option, whether it's politically right or not. The only other point, I'll make two other points quickly. I think what we've seen during COVID is what I call the consumer e-commerce effect. E-commerce has grown exponentially, but it's not just for the consumer. We're now getting industrial companies, business to business, expecting the same sort of levels of service that we as consumers expected, when we ordered something on Amazon. So that's another sort of pressure on us to get our businesses going at a faster clock speed. I think the final comment I'd make, and I say this, I've been looking at this for years, is look, we are not going to get fundamental change till we start recognizing that the way we design our organization structures vertically with our functions or even business units, and expect them to handle the vertical and the horizontal flows, we're never going to quite make it, because as everything speeds up, people who are managing the vertical functions haven't got the time to also put the same effort into managing the horizontal cross-functional flows. And when you look at companies like Zara, that's why they're so good, because they've got cross-functional teams looking after the horizontal flows, and they've got vertical specialisms looking after production and logistics and marketing, and they all talk to each other and they're all in together. So I think I'm hoping that more and more companies will start to experiment with different organisation structures, because that's when we will get what I call a true transformative change, which will be driven and underpinned by the wonderful technology that we've already got at our disposal.
Thank you, John. Priti?
Sure. So I think my closing comments in line with what we're talking about would be really, if we're looking at how connected the global supply chain is, right? And I think very recently the whole pandemic and the Suez Canal, many other events have really pointed towards extreme connected global supply chain. At the same time, there have been efforts by countries to say let's localize a supply chain, or probably make them more independent supply chain. So it'll be very interesting to see how how companies can really come together, effectively collaborate to form a fine balance of the two. So to me, I think that is something which we should really look towards, and I'm sure there's a lot going with all the supply chain professionals who can make a difference in this changing new supply chain world. That'll be my closing comment.
Thank you, Priti. Manish?
Yeah, so my closing comments will be on something that John had mentioned earlier, that gone are the days when you had huge ERP implementations, and now the world is all about smaller implementations of how we want to improve our supply chains and businesses at large. My comment around that would be, I think organizations need to be extremely focused on evaluating such investments after they've been made. Obviously, there will be a case for making those smaller investments because it's not big money like the ERP, but smaller money. Make it from the lens of how much of the decision time of the management was cut down as a result of that investment. So if you're investing and it's cutting down your ability to decide as an organization, that is to me, the biggest barometer of success of technology, that it's aiding cutting down the decision time. Because without technology, believe me, decisions will always get taken. It's just that it takes much longer time. So with technology, use that lens. Investment that helps you cut down decision making should be the one that you should be running for over and over again. That would be my
Ashish, let's get both of you also. 1 minute.
Well, yeah, closing comments, right. I think I concur with everyone in terms of the fact that investments will be made in a very pocketed way. But again, if you remember when again, I'm revealing my age here, but when we started our supply chain journey and when we read the book The Goal by Dr. Not John Gattorna. By Ellie Goldratt, right? So it was interesting because he did talk about that sum total of local optima is not equal to global optima, right? And it's important that when we are making these decisions of pocketed improvements, we do not forget this whole end-to-end map. You do not need to sink in huge money in terms of investing immediately for an end-to-end, but have that picture in mind before you start doing these incremental improvements, because otherwise you will need to do some undoing somewhere down the line, which could be much more it can cost you both in terms of dollars and time. So have that map in mind and then start building your journey towards it, both in terms of supply chain resilience and sustainability. That really helps. And I've seen companies doing that very effectively. They're not sinking in huge amount of money immediately, but they are very clear about their 5-year journey or 4-year journey and how they are going to have this crawl, walk, run, sprint kind of a map ironed out. That'll be my
Thank you, Ashish. Cherie, your last 1 minute.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I have 2 comments. And by building resilient supply chains, by that, I would think we mean that there's going to be a lot more disruptions that's going to take place in supply chains, and therefore we need to get prepared. And in order to get prepared, I think that it's really important to really build long-term sustainable supply chains. And that means that it's the role and responsibility of every professional within supply chain to understand what sustainability means in their work and how they're contributing to make sustainable, transparent supply chains such that they're helping to build resilience and they're helping to innovate and drive long-term stability within their supply chains and build much more impact in what they're doing.
Thank you, Cherie, and thanks, John, Priti, Ashish, Manish. This has been a very fantastic panel, and we have taken the growth pillars for success for the APAC region, advancing the digital economy, enabling regional enterprise growth, rebalancing supply chains, and fostering innovations, expanding the future-proofing the labor force. I think this is what Cherie really contributed in a good way, and building climate change resilience towards a net zero future. I think all these are going to be the parameters on which the new supply chain is going to be made. Priti, I have one comment on the globalization. There's a very interesting report that has come from Pankaj Gemaut from DHL, who says that the world definitely is global, but it's more local, and it has remained very focused local. So if Asia Pacific has to grow, connectivity is no question it has to grow. But the localization, the local economies of Asia Pacific and national economies also will have to be catered to for Asia to emerge as the growth hub and a powerful regions which dictate supply chains of the world. And I think Asia has some concern on the local front, and that is where we need to really strengthen local supply chain, more social supply chain. We need to strengthen, the farming supply chain. If you go to Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, India, I think we need very different approaches towards building the global value chain, where we have amazing competitive advantages in the world. We should not ignore that. Yes, multinational needs to be leveraged for the global trade, and technology definitely brings that visibility. I agree with all the comments that we need to prioritize our technology adoption so that the complete control tower comes into picture. Thank you very much for such a great insight. And on behalf of ISCM, I really thank you participating at this first APAC event.